Welcome to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. I'm DT Kane, author of the epic fantasy series The Aggresfar Saga and the spoken books Uprising. Each week, I read from one of my novels, discuss my writing process, answer your questions, and have general discussions about fantasy fiction. It's like a book club, except I do all the work for you. Find show notes, info about all my novels, and much more at dtkane.com. Here's the show. All right. Hello, everyone out there, and welcome to, what we're going to call Season 2 of DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Thank you very much for sticking around here so long and getting all the way through the Acktus Trials with me, Part 1 of the Spoken Books Uprising. And today, we continue our journey together as we begin reading Part 2 of the Spoken Books Uprising, which is called Declaimer's Discovery. But first, just a quick announcement, one that I am pretty excited about and that I talked about at the end of last week's episode. But I have started a Patreon account. I had some folks asking if there was a way to support me and the podcast in a way other than purchasing books, and this is one possible way for you to do that. As I said last week, the podcast is remaining 100% free of charge, so you do not have to do anything in order to continue listening as you have been each week. But if you are interested in giving me some extra support and getting some nice perks to go along with that, consider signing up for my Patreon. That's at patreon.com/DTKane. There are 3 levels of support you can sign up for, named, of course, after titles in the Spoken Books Uprising. The first level is the Keeper level, which will be $3.99 per month, and basically under that you're going to get a copy of every ebook that I have ever written as of the date you sign up, and then you'll also be signed up to receive a free copy of each new ebook that I release after the date you sign up, for as long as you're a patron. You will also get recognition in my weekly email newsletter, and maybe the most attractive to some of you, I don't know, but there will also be an exclusive patrons-only monthly podcast episode, which I will be starting here probably in a few months. But that's something for you to look forward to as well if you decide to join the Patreon. The second level will be the Orator level, which is $9.99 per month. You'll get all of those perks I just mentioned in the Keeper level, including the exclusive monthly podcast episode. You will also receive copies of all the physical books that I have released as of the date that you join. Those will be shipping over the course of 90 days after you sign up, just so you get that. You'll also, as an Orator, you will receive a free copy of each physical book I release after the date you sign up, and you will also receive email recognition in my weekly email newsletter. And Orators will also be noted in the acknowledgments section of each book that I release. So if you'd like to see your name in print, consider signing up at the Orator level. And finally, if you are truly a super fan out there, and like I said last week, I am not arrogant enough to think that I actually have true super fans out there, but I've had several people be pretty enthusiastic about the Spoken Books Uprising, so maybe there are a couple out there. You can join at the Declaimer level. As we know, Declaimers are quite rare. So this is the highest tier of membership, $14.99 a month. You get all of the perks of the Keeper and Orator levels, including the monthly extra podcast episode. And you'll also get a couple of pretty interesting perks here. One, you get this unique opportunity to participate in my drafting process. You'll get live access to my drafts through a shared Google Doc. That'll be read-only. You won't be able to edit my work, but I think I will leave comments on, so you can kind of watch me draft in real time and leave me some comments, and you can kind of see stories get shaped from the beginning. You will also get one free personal message in my newsletter or podcast per quarter, so if you'd like me to, give you a birthday shout-out on the show or in the newsletter, or, if you have a story you'd like me to share with the listeners, or even if you are a writer like me, I will give you a quick plug on the podcast or in the newsletter. Obviously these messages are within reason. I'm not going to post anything that I deem inappropriate, but within reason, you'll get, the option to have one of those messages per quarter. So for each year. You'll also get recognition in the weekly email newsletter and in my acknowledgments sections of future books, and I will also read your name aloud at the end of each podcast episode. So that's all. If you're interested, patreon.com/DTKane. And if you are looking to support me, but, maybe the extra monetary support just isn't in the cards for you right now, a couple easy ways you can help support me. Leave a review of the Acktus Trials and any other of the spoken books you have read on Amazon or wherever else you buy books. Also, Goodreads is a good place to leave reviews. Those reviews really help me out. The more reviews my books have, the more attention they garner from both the retailers and other folks that are looking for books to feature. So that's great. And also consider leaving a review of the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Okay, personal plugging is over here, so let's get into Declaimer's discovery. Declaimer's Discovery, Part 2 of the Spoken Books Uprising by D.T. Kane. Prologue. "Reading books can get you killed, Stefan," said Duke Joseph Galfet. Stefan humphed from where he stood, looking over the Duke's shoulder. He continued staring at the page Joseph had set out before him on his writing desk. "And permitting me to teach you to scribe can get you killed, my good Duke." Joseph's shoulders stiffened. "Don't take such a tone with me. I have kept your secret, and this is how you speak to me?" Stefan sighed, stepping back. A delicate game he played, and sometimes he forgot the role he'd assumed. "My humblest apologies, Duke Galfet." Stefan gave what he considered an exaggerated bow, though Joseph would likely deem it merely sufficient. As Stefan swept his arm downward, his miento proxatori chimed like tiny bells. They were 2 sets of 5 rings, one for each finger, the rings connected by fine chain links. No one had ever bothered to translate their name out of the old tongue, likely because he was the only person in oration who possessed a set of them. Joseph glanced over his shoulder, a sour set to his plump lips. He hadn't succumbed to the sloth or gluttony like some of the other older readers Stefan had encountered, but he still needed to rest after ascending the stairs that led to his chambers here at the top of Galfet Library. "Don't patronize me, Stefan. I know you think yourself above me, though scribes only know where you acquired such a notion. Maybe it's those gaudy robes you wear. I know we like our bright colors here in Fortune, but really, you take it too far. But if you truly can teach me to pen a new spoken book, well, I'll accept nearly any degree of arrogance toward me in private, so long as you act the docile servant in public. Yes, my Duke. If you're not careful, you'll be giving my speakers ideas. Bad enough you convinced me to propose legislation to give them a day of rest each week. Soon they'll be asking for wages if I'm not careful. Many of the other dukes are already whispering that I've grown soft in my old age." "Not soft, my Duke. You're just a realist. Men can only take so much before they begin to resist." Joseph snorted derisively. "Don't quote Scrivenic rhetoric to me. The tale of Devonstair the Steadfast and his 7 trials might be a famous one, but I've no wish to endure even a single trial just to help a handful of slaves." "Sometimes stories hold more truth than reality," Stefan replied, permitting just a hint of amusement into his tone. That tongue of yours is going to get you in trouble, Stefan. Yes, my. Stefan cut off abruptly as the hair on his arms rose, a dread chill washing over his entire body. A moment later, a thump came from outside the door to the Duke's chambers. "Oh, what now?" Joseph asked. "I thought I left orders not to be disturbed. Stefan, do go and tell whoever that is to go away." Stefan schooled his face back to calm, though an anxious tension in his shoulders remained. There was only one thing that sensation could mean. "Of course, my Duke." He strode out of the study, shutting the door behind him and stepping into the spacious living room that doubled as an entry hall to the Duke's quarters. It was furnished in dark wood with jade inlays. Plants adorned the nearby tabletops, and the room even had a small fountain, burbling softly in the darkness. The sun had long since set, and most of the room's drapes were drawn, leaving just a thin sliver of moonlight creeping across the floor. A mirrored stand lamp provided the only other light in the room, casting looming shadows about the space. Stefan approached the main entry door. He took a deep breath and prepared to draw power from the flames dancing in the lamp. Then he threw the door open. The first thing he noticed was the smell, an aroma like the aftermath of lightning having struck a steel rod, a sort of alkaline bitterness that he could taste as much as smell. Its source quickly became apparent. Duke Joseph's massive guard, what did they call them? Harbors? A broad, muscle-bound man with a scar across the bridge of his nose was slumped against the wall opposite the door. His mouth was open in a silent howl, streaks of black running from his lips and up the sides of his face. His skin had shriveled like a dried prune, and one of his eyes appeared to have been burned away, a dark lump of carbon all that remained in the socket. "Oh, it's only you, Stefan," said a relieved voice. Its owner was a dark-skinned man with a shaved head. He wore a black shirt and pants, and his short hair made apparent the dragon branded on his forehead. As the speaker stepped into the door frame, Stefan scowled at a spoken book bound in black leather tucked under his arm. Two other men appeared behind the first, one branded similarly to the man who'd spoken, the other wearing a narrow-brimmed hat with the scales of an influencer crudely stitched onto the band. "Bookman, what do you think you're doing?" Stefan asked, trying to mask the relief in his tone with annoyance. Just a fool casting a spell, not nearly as bad as what Stefan had feared he'd find upon opening the door, though it was a serious problem in its own right. "It's starting, Stefan! It's starting!" Bookman's tone was almost gleeful. "Starting? Don't be a fool. The warriors' plans are weeks, maybe months away from being ready. And besides, what do you intend? Rise against the one library that's shown any support at all for your cause?" The brightness in Bookman's features faded. He glanced to his companions before turning back to Stefan with obstinance in his eyes. "Maeve moves too slowly, Stefan, and the wicked man who smiles is still evil. We will wait no longer. My brothers and sisters will suffer not another minute under the thumb of these hoarders. Shattered ink files!" Stefan rubbed at his temples with the thumb and middle finger of one hand. Here he'd been, attempting to push events as subtly as he could in the right direction, and these bumbling oryxes were going to ruin everything with their impatience. "Where did you get that book?" he asked, motioning at the dark tome stuffed under Bookman's arm. Bookman glanced at the volume with satisfaction. "Galfet's youngest boy left it out in the speaking room when he went to dinner. Told Gerard here to put it away for him. He practically handed us the opportunity to rise up. It was a sign from the scribes, Stefan. We had to take it." Which one of you read the murder?" "What? What does it? Which one?" Stefan dropped the tone of moderate civility he'd forced himself to assume since first coming to Galfat Library. Bookman flinched back, face paling. None denied Stefan when he used that tone. "I did. Spells of shadow don't come off most others' tongues quite right, but I've always had a bit of a knack for them. Not that there's often an opportunity for me to speak them." "Enough of this," the third man, the one in the hat, said. He had the same shaved head, dark clothing, and speaker's brand as the other two. "Do you mean to try and stop us, Stefan, or will you let us in?" He drew a long knife from his belt and brandished it as if Stefan should be afraid. Instead, Stefan snorted at the weapon and went back to rubbing his temples. A waste! What a blasted waste this was going to cause! He'd spent months groveling to Joseph at every turn, secretly teaching him to scribe, while also teaching these boys to read, and now they were going to throw their lives away, sure as if they'd slit their own wrists. But Stefan's hands were tied. He'd already meddled far too much in the workings of the true path, and, in all likelihood, Bookman would be following that harbor he'd just killed to the grave before long, so stopping him wasn't worth the effort anyway. These days, very few could read a murder from a spoken book of shadow and survive for long, not since an act of desperation all those years ago had corrupted the element of shadow. "It is not my place to question the direction in which the true path takes you," Stefan said. "If this is what you wish, I will not stop you, but know that I think it a fool act, one that will only hamper the other's efforts." Bookman once again looked uncertain for a moment, but his comrades were obviously far less concerned over Stefan's opinion. "Don't try to guilt us with your Scrivenic Dogma," Gerard said. "We'll make our own path, and it starts with butchering Joseph Galfat like the plump pig he is." The resolve returned to Bookman's eyes. "He's right, Stefan. Now, out of our way." Stefan sighed. That was the problem with most men. You could only lead them so far before they had to make choices on their own, and most were too nearsighted to make the right ones. "I trust you'll remember I tried to stop you while your bodies are being broken on the Conservators' torture wheels." Perhaps that had been too harsh, but Stefan was perturbed, and these men really were walking to their deaths. Partly, his anger was over the ruination of his work these men were about to sow. But another part of him lamented over his own effectiveness. For all he'd tried to do for these men, he'd failed them, and they would soon be paying the ultimate price for his shortfall. With that potent mixture of bitterness and guilt swirling in his mind, Stefan didn't bother stepping aside to let the men go about their grim task. Rather, he concentrated his elemental power, splitting his mind to focus on each of the 5 elements that made up all things. A moment later, he vanished from the room. Hello there, friends. I am coming to you from the future. I hope you enjoyed listening to the prologue there of Declaimer's Discovery. I say I'm coming to you from the future because I'm actually recording this little bit of video after the bulk of the analysis section here. And if you're watching on YouTube, you'll notice that I don't have any video this week for the analysis section. My apologies. I was about 3 minutes away from finishing the recording and the power went out at my house. And when I turned my computer back on, there was a file saved that was over 1 gigabyte, so all the data was there, but it was corrupted. I eventually got it repaired and managed to at least salvage the audio, but the audio would not sync with the video no matter what I did, and I figured it just wasn't worth my time to try to get it to sync up right. So, if you're watching on YouTube, I apologize, but you'll just have to stare at the thumbnail of my beautiful face holding up the cover of Declaimer's Discovery there. But otherwise, I hope you enjoy listening to my analysis of the prologue of Declaimer's Discovery, and we'll be back to our regularly scheduled video programming next week. And in the meanwhile, I apparently need to go buy a surge protector with a battery in it so that this does not happen to me again. Hope you enjoy the analysis. All right, welcome back once again to the podcast, everyone. It's Sunday, July 24th, 2022, as I record this, which is episode 28 of the podcast overall, and the first episode of Season 2, as we already discussed here at the beginning. And since we chatted a bit before the episode began today, I'm just going to jump right into our analysis here. So we just read the prologue of Declaimer's Discovery, Part 2 of the Spoken Books Uprising, and hope no one was too disappointed not to see Baz yet. Don't worry, he will be with us again next week. But as with the Acktus Trials, we start off with a prologue and some characters who we aren't too familiar with. So we have Stefan, who is our viewpoint character here from this chapter, and Duke Joseph Galfet. And what are we witnessing here at the very beginning? Well, it looks like this Stefan character is teaching Duke Galfet how to write a new spoken book. So that should jump right off the page at you here, because we kind of pretty well established back in Book 1 that new spoken books have not been created for quite some time. So lots of implications here right off the bat. First of all, so Duke Joseph, well, he's a duke, right? So he's pretty powerful, right? He leads a library. But if he's learning to write a new spoken book, that means he's a cuss, right? Because we learned you have to be bound to the spoken books in order to be able to write one. So somehow he has arisen to the top of society here, despite apparently being able to both speak and read. So that's interesting. Also interesting that he still doesn't really have too fond a view of other speakers, right? Even if it's never spoken aloud here, but even if he himself could very well have been a speaker, apparently. So that's interesting. But enough about Duke Joseph. I think the more interesting character here is really Stefan, who is teaching him to read. Again, our perspective character here. You know, who is this guy? There's a bunch of we learned a bunch about him, and maybe some of our more perceptive listeners out there might be able to ferret out who this guy is, but not terribly important right now if you can't. But what do we have here? So we got the description of him, not much of a physical description, but he's got these rings, right? He wears 5 rings on each finger connected by fine lengths of chain. So it's 2 sets, right? So his hands aren't chained together, but the rings on each of his hands are connected, so kind of like almost like little webbing in between each of his fingers. He's got this colorful robe on, apparently. He can read and write. That's a typo there. He can read and speak, right? We do later see him at least getting ready to cast a spell. But if he is teaching Duke Joseph how to create a new spoken book, presumably Stefan is also a cuss, and Joseph does say, I have kept your secrets. Obviously, what else could Stefan's secret be other than he can both, read and speak, and thus draw power from spoken books. Though hold that for a second, drawing power from spoken books. Like I said, he's teaching a reader how to scribe. So interesting here. Some covert things are going on here in this Galfet library. And we see he doesn't exactly seem to know what a harbor is, right? Which is weird. If he's kind of high up in a library here, harbors are pretty commonplace, at least you would think. But when he does, we'll see in a minute here. He goes, he'll go to see what the ruckus was at the door, and he sees the harbor outside of it. He's like, his big guard. What do they call them? So he's not entirely sure about that. So that's interesting that he doesn't seem to have the vernacular of society down. So kind of curious here. This scene starting off. Obviously, lots of unanswered questions here. We also, learn, while Duke Joseph seems to be, the kind of the typical arrogant reader here that we grew accustomed to seeing in book 1. He has also apparently proposed legislation to give speakers a day of rest, which, from our point of view out here in the real world, not terribly a big deal. They're still slaves, right? But in the world of oration, proposing any rights for speakers is kind of a big deal. So he does seem to be somewhat sympathetic to them, even if he's still an arrogant reader. And speaking of that proposed legislation, so where are we? Well, we are somewhere we have yet to go in the spoken books universe, the city of Fortune. That's stated explicitly more than once here in the chapter. So Galfet Library is apparently one of the libraries in Fortune. And Stefan talks about this role that he has, quote, assumed here in Fortune, and how, he sometimes has lapses, and he seems to assert himself more than he should be based on the role he has assumed. So that raises even more questions about Stefan. Is he like a spy or something? He seems to imply that maybe he's not necessarily supposed to be here, but he's kind of wormed his way in. So just another thing to keep an eye on there. I like his quote here. It seems like maybe Stefan is the one who put this bug in Duke Joseph's ear about the legislation for speakers. Stefan says at one point here, men can only take so much before they begin to resist. So it seems Stefan has been counseling the Duke here to give speakers increased rights. So, maybe that plays in. Maybe Stefan's one of these seekers of transcendence that we learned about in Undertone back in book 1, secretly supporting a return of people who are bound to the spoken books to power, and seeking the identity of the Declaimer from the Declaimer's transcendence, who is supposed to lead the slaves to freedom. But we certainly don't know that yet, but maybe some evidence here to suggest that. We hear both Duke Joseph and then later the 3 speakers that Stefan meets at the door talk about this Scrivenic Dogma, which I don't think we explicitly talked about here in the first book, but we know the scribes were worshipped like gods, at least by some people, in book 1. So Scrivenic Dogma would seem to reference that kind of fervent belief in the teachings of the scribes. We see Stefan reference the true path a couple of times. Again, at this point, we don't really know what that means, but, it's capitalized and it's kind of said in tandem with this idea of Scrivenic Dogma. So some sort of religious belief, the true path. Maybe it's like nirvana or something for people who participate in the scribes' religion. A little more insight into Stefan. Maybe he's a religious person here, but again, still not entirely clear. Stefan also says he's been trying to subtly influence events, but he's already meddled too much. So interesting, there seems to be some sort of constraint working on Stefan here as well. So despite, he seems to have done an awful lot here, right? He's teaching a reader how to write new books, a reader who apparently is a cuss, and then he admits later that he was also teaching some speakers how to read. So he's been meddling quite a bit, but for whatever reason, he's hit his limit here when he meets these speakers at the door. So why don't we talk about that for a minute? So him and Duke Joseph are kind of interrupted by some sort of ruckus at the door. Duke Joseph is perturbed because he told everyone in the library not to disturb him, obviously because he's doing something illegal here in his chambers. But he sends Stefan to the door to tell them to go away. And Stefan is actually kind of alarmed here, right? The hairs on his arms kind of raise up, and it seems like he's getting ready to for a fight when he goes to open the door. In fact, it says he's getting ready to draw elemental power from the torches in the room before he opens the door, which is interesting. You might have caught this if you were perceptive. This isn't a mistake, but he doesn't have a book with him, at least not that we know of. But he still seems to be preparing to cast a spell. So, could he be a Declaimer? Remember, a Declaimer, we learned back in Book 1, is someone who can cast spells without a book. I suppose that's possible. Stefan also has a book hidden on his person that we just didn't learn about. But, curiouser and curiouser here about this Stefan character. So he throws open the door here, and, whatever Stefan was worried about, it does not appear that it's actually what he finds, because he's relieved when he opens the door. But the Duke's harbor here is dead when he opens the door, slumped against the wall. His skin is kind of turned gray and gone taut over his face like a dried fruit, I believe is the description I use. One of his eyes is kind of just burned away, like it was just burned out of the socket. So it seems like he's been attacked by someone, and that someone actually turns out to be three someones. There are three speakers at the door who apparently know Stefan. Stefan actually admits in his inner dialogue to having taught them how to read. And the three are led by this speaker called Bookman. And we quickly learn that they are there to kill Duke Joseph, which angers Stefan here. When they reveal their plan to Stefan, he's like, and they reference the Warriors, right? Or at least Stefan does. Stefan says the Warriors' plans are months away from being ready. Well, it would seem these Warriors are rebels who are somehow aligned with these three speakers at the door. And, by attacking now, these three speakers are messing up some sort of plan that the Warriors have to attack. We see Bookman reference Maeve, which is a woman's name, maybe the Warriors' leader, but he says she's moving too slowly, which is why they are accelerating at least their timeline for an attack here on their library. And Stefan's like, geez, Galfet Library is the one library who is actually somewhat friendly to speakers. You're gonna kill Duke Galfet, because remember, he has proposed this legislation apparently that gives speakers at least some level of rights here, a right to rest every so many days. And how does Bookman reply? Well, the wicked man who smiles is still evil. I like that. It's an interesting way to put it, right? And I think it's a good way to summarize really what's been done here. Well, we're not going to give you any rights, and we're still going to treat you crappy, but we'll let you rest every few days, and Bookman might have the better of the argument here over Stefan. Are there degrees of evil, or once you get to evil, it doesn't really matter? It's an interesting question, but even if you're a lower degree of evil, you're still evil and probably don't deserve any better treatment than someone who is somehow more evil than you. Or maybe not. Maybe that's an interesting debate. I don't think that's something I really want to get into right now. My philosophy cardigan is in storage for the summer here, so we won't put that on right now. But the wicked man who smiles is still evil. I like that, like I said. Right, so these speakers, they are gonna go through with their plan here, whatever Stefan says. It seems. We also get some interesting insight here to maybe. It seems Stefan detected that a shadow spell was being used outside the door. That's why the hairs on his arm rose. And it seemed like maybe he expected someone different to be using shadow than the folks that he ended up finding there, these 3 speakers. But Stefan does make this reference here. An act of desperation all those years ago corrupted the element of shadow. So, what's he talking about here? An act of desperation all those years ago corrupted by the element of shadow. I think instead of discussing this, I'd love to hear your thoughts out there. If you're just following along here on the show, let me know what you think that means, or if you've already read Book 2, but now you're just listening to the podcast here, I'd love to know what you thought that meant at the time when you were reading it for the first time. Shoot me an email, dtkane@dtkane.com. But Stefan obviously knows something here about the element of shadow that it would seem like some other people maybe don't, and maybe that also explains why the element is considered so dangerous. It's been corrupted somehow. You remember, Baz doesn't really want to have anything to do with shadow. At least he didn't back in the first book. And, remember how terrible it was when he did cast that one shadow spell. And it also seemed to, make him hear voices in his head, which, incidentally, we learned were the voices of the Dark Ones. So maybe slowly getting some insight into what's going on with the element of shadow and why it's so dangerous. But ultimately, it comes down to these 3 speakers tell Stefan to either step aside or they're going to make him step aside. We get maybe the sense that if Stefan didn't want to step aside, they wouldn't be able to make him. But again, Stefan says he's already meddled too much, and that's the problem with men, right? You can only teach them so much before they have to make choices on their own, and most make the wrong choices. So he is very frustrated with these 3 here. It almost seems like he has been taking them under his wing a bit. Now he's like, oh, you are. It's like watching your children, just try to do something on their own and trip and fall. Except here, Stefan thinks they are going to their deaths here. But again, for whatever reason, this external constraint on him is restraining him from interfering any further. And so he doesn't step aside, right? But it says he just vanishes. What is that? He just vanishes? Am I just taking liberties here? A little literary liberty, being colorful in the description here. Or did he actually vanish? This Stefan person is certainly mysterious here, but ultimately what we have here in the prologue, there appears to be a rebellion in the works of the Speakers in Fortune, which is the 3rd city of the Triumvirate, along with Enigma and Erstwhile. Erstwhile is the city that Baz is from. So I think it's safe to assume that this rebellion here is going to be relevant to the rest of the story, since we're setting it up here in the prologue, but we'll have to wait until next week to find that out. So that's the prologue here of Declaimer's Discovery. And before we wrap up here, I thought it might just be interesting for me to talk for a few minutes about the historical inspiration behind the Spoken Books Uprising. I didn't really talk about this all that much in Season 1 because there's not too much of this inspiration in the first in Part 1, the Acktus Trials, but a lot of the rest of the series I have very loosely, let's be clear here, very loosely based on some of the facts of the Haitian slave revolution, which occurred kind of approximately from 1791 to 1804. And I'm by no means an expert on the Haitian slave revolt, but I have I've read about it a little, and it is kind of recognized as the only successful slave revolt in history. So just a couple quick facts here. I'm not going to go on and on about historical stuff, but the revolt began in 1791, and before that, for those of you who don't know, before it was called Haiti, Haiti was called Saint-Domingue. I think that's how you pronounce it. Sorry. Sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation there, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Saint-Domingue. And it shares the island of Hispaniola with what is now the Dominican Republic. The island's kind of split in half. Back then, the Dominican Republic was called Santo Domingo. So Saint-Domingue was a French possession, where Santo Domingo was owned by the Spanish, and the main crop there in Haiti was sugarcane, which is pretty labor-intensive to farm and harvest, and then there's a kind of an extensive milling process that sugarcane has to go through to actually turn it into sugar. So all of that requires a lot of hard labor. So that resulted in hundreds of thousands of slaves coming into Haiti in the 1700s to man all of the sugar plantations there. I think by 1790, which is right before the revolution began, there were something like 500,000 slaves in Haiti, compared to only, out of a total population of 550,000. So we're like 90% of the population was slaves in Haiti by the time they rebelled in 1791. Just a few things that kind of inspired some things in the book from the revolution here. Slaves were marked with brands in Haiti, so we see that here in the spoken books as well. The speakers have their brands on their foreheads. Injuries were frequent amongst the slaves in Haiti. You had to cut down sugarcane with machetes. So there was the risk of being cut by those, and sugarcane is quite sharp as well. So lots of cuts and infections there out in the fields. Also working long hours and then having to go to the sugarcane mills, which there's lots of like grinding and pressing going on in those. So getting limbs caught in those machines was a common injury for slaves as well. Punishments were quite brutal for slaves, as they were in lots of other parts of the world as well. But whipping was common, rubbing things like lemon, hot peppers, or salt, ashes in wounds to make them hurt even more, throwing boiling sugar juice on slaves, some of the common punishments here. So obviously terrible conditions these slaves lived under. And there's also this general idea in several of the books I've read about just keeping the slaves uneducated to make sure that they didn't get any ideas about rising up. And this is an idea we see in the spoken books Uprising as well. The slaves are not even taught to read, and reading is such a big part of how knowledge is passed on, and it is easier to keep an ignorant population submissive than one that, is able to read and educate itself and kind of see what the possibilities beyond the oppressive government are. So that's certainly a theme that I play up in the spoken books Uprising, that's inspired, at least in part, by some of these terrible conditions that were going on in Haiti at the time. I think I'll keep referencing back every now and again to parts of the revolution that influenced the story here. Just a couple quick facts here. August 1791, that's when the rebellion actually began, and it began at Galifay Plantation. So that's kind of that's the inspiration for Duke Galfet's name here. I guess it probably should be Galfay if I was sticking to the French pronunciation, but I went with Galfet for the book here. And it's interesting, but Galifay Plantation was actually considered one of the nicer plantations to work on for slaves. But, as I kind of referenced, here again, the wicked man who smiles is still evil. So, sure, you're being nice to your slaves, but they're still slaves. So, you really get a pass? You probably shouldn't be getting a pass. You're keeping slaves. That's the important thing here. The initial leader of the uprising was a man called Bookman or Baukman. I'm not exactly sure how that's pronounced, but he was one of the initial leaders of the uprising. He kind of oversaw this famous firelight ceremony at a place called Boys Cayman. Again, apologies for the pronunciations here. But it's kind of late night celebration where everyone swore an oath to the rebellion. And interesting too, they had a plan. I think the insurrection was supposed to begin in September. I guess there was some big political meeting where all of the elites were going to be distracted by it at the Capitol, and they were planning to have the rebellion start then when everyone was distracted. But some of the slaves got antsy and acted early, so they had to accelerate their timeline, which seems is kind of like what happened here in the prologue as well. Stefan references this plan of the warriors being months away from being ready, but these speakers here at Galfet Library are impatient. They are not going to live under the thumb of their readers any longer. So another little parallel there. Again, Bookman is the name of the lead speaker here in the prologue, which obviously is a direct reference to the leader of the revolt in August of 1791. And last, we briefly see Stefan reference the Conservators' torture wheel, which was not a method of torture that I was familiar with before I studied the Haitian Revolution a little, but apparently it's literally just they took like a big wagon wheel and crushed people's bones with it and ran them over with it. It was a form of torture that was popular in Haiti. I know it's probably terrible to say any form of torture was popular, but that it was used extensively in Haiti. So we'll be seeing that feature throughout the book. We'll see some references to that. So just so you know, the original inspiration there for that device. Okay, I think that's enough of a history lesson here for now. If you are curious, some future reading for you. A couple of the books that I read about the Revolution enjoyed were Avengers of the New World by Laurent Dubois and Black Spartacus, The Epic Life of Toussaint L'Ouverture, who ultimately became kind of the face of and the leader of the rebellion in Haiti after Bookman was killed shortly after the insurrection began. And that Black Spartacus is by, and again, sorry for the pronunciation here, but Sudhir Hazari Singh. I'm sure that's totally off, but there you go. Black Spartacus: The Epic Life of Toussaint L'Ouverture. You can look that up if you are interested in more reading about the Haitian slave revolution. All right, so next week we're going to read chapters 1 and 2. And again, like I said, we'll be back with Baz. What do you make of the sticky situation Baz finds himself in? How have he and Liana been getting along since we left them at the end of part 1? And what do you think the guard wants with Baz and Liana? Obviously, you'll find out who the guard is as you read chapters 1 and 2. So that's your homework. And as always, if you don't have time to do your homework, that's okay, because I'll do all the reading for you, as well as answering those questions and many more next week on the show. I do have a listener question this week. Jan asked, why I chose to independently publish my novels as opposed to going a traditional publishing route. I've not prepared a extended answer to this question, so this is just kind of off the cuff and from the heart here, but I did briefly try to engage a literary agent for my first book, Blade Sorrow, several years ago when I was ready to put it out into the world. I guess for those of you who aren't too familiar with the traditional publishing process, you can't really go directly to the big publishing houses. you need a literary agent to represent you, and that literary agent has contacts at the big publishing houses, and they go and try to sell your book to them, which kind of right off the bat's a little shady, right? Like you can't just send your book into the people who are actually publishing it. You need this middleman. Maybe shady's not the right word, but you can see how that just complicates the process. And I suppose that system arose because they were just getting so much crap coming into the publishing houses. But still. So I spent a couple months researching agents and writing letters to them, and I wasn't really getting anywhere. And I was like, I could just be writing more books in this time that I'm wasting researching these random people and hoping one of them, decides that my book is good enough to be one of the 10 this year that they decide to represent. So that was kind of the big one. It just felt like a big game and waste of time. And, you do hear lots of horror stories about the traditional publishing market these days. I know there are obviously plenty of people who have had great success in traditional publishing, and I'm not necessarily anti-traditional publishing, but you do hear about lots of, kind of mid-list authors who, they don't have they're fine writers, but they've just never had a bestseller, and they're kind of just like left out to dry by their agents or their traditional publishers. And this is a big factor for me too. Most traditional publishing houses, when you sign with them, they'll require that you sign all of your rights to your work away to them, so you lose all control over your work. So, say someone gives you a deal and you sell all of your rights to them, and then the book just doesn't do as well as the publishing house was hoping initially. I mean, they can just stop printing it, and basically you're not getting any money from it anymore, and they're not making it anymore. But you also don't have the legal right to control it, so you've kind of just tossed your work into a black hole that you can never get it back from. So that was a big reason. I didn't really feel comfortable signing all of my rights away to my work to a traditional publishing house. So that was a big thing too. Okay, coming back to here. Sorry for the pause in the audio. And hello there to those listening on YouTube. You'll now see me on the video instead of staring at the thumbnail there. As I said, I lost power for a while, and I'm having to re-record just this last bit of the show. So I was answering Jan's question about why I chose to independently publish my novels. I was about to give my third and final reason. The first one was the game of having to try to find a literary agent. The second one was not wanting to sign my rights away to my work. And the third reason is really just how much easier, relatively speaking, it's become to be successful self-publishing. In the past probably like 10 to 15 years, I think a lot of people, when they hear about someone self-publishing, they have this picture in their mind of someone, ordering like 1,000 of their books and, trying to like sell them out of their garage or something. But that's not really the way of things these days. As far as physical books go, print on demand is a thing, which means, if you go onto Amazon right now and order a copy of one of my books in paperback, there is not a warehouse somewhere or a DT Kane garage somewhere that's full of my books. Rather, once you complete your order, Amazon just prints a single copy of my book and mails it to you. So that's the print on demand idea. So that's obviously made it a lot easier for authors. But even more so is the rise of ebooks. Most of my sales come from ebooks, and obviously, you don't need any physical stock at all for ebooks. You just got to upload your file. So, that's made things a lot easier for self-published authors. And really just the infrastructure, the distribution. Distribution was the hardest problem, right? In Amazon and Draft Digital. Those are the two. I primarily use Kobo as well. They're a bit larger in Canada and some places in Europe, though you can read on Kobo in the US as well. They all, there's a separate author dashboard that I have access to as an author on those platforms, and I just upload my books to there, and they handle the distribution of the electronic files to their users on their customer-facing web stores. So just the ease of it, and honestly, the nice thing about self-publishing too. Again, I said relatively easy. It's not easy. It is still it's a job like anything else. A job I am passionate about. And frankly, I have not even made it, in air quotes, yet. I'm still working my day job, as we discussed last week. But a nice thing about independent publishing, too, is it's really, you can make a career potentially out of it without becoming a best-selling author. That's, one of the problems with traditional publishing is, you either hit it big and, you're a bestseller, or, some, I know some mid-list authors are, successful too. They make enough money to make a living out of it. But so many authors, their first or second book just doesn't do quite as well as they were hoping, and then they kind of flounder into irrelevance. And if you're just focused on traditional publishing, it can be really hard to get back into the game at that point. Publishers, after you've had one or two books that kind of had disappointing sales, they're not going to necessarily give you another look, or at least it's a lot harder to get them to give you a look. Whereas in the self-publishing world, you can never be a bestseller, but if you can just keep pumping out books and you build a small fan base, selling, several thousand books a year, you'd be a failure in traditional publishing. But if you're selling several thousand books at, $5 a pop, so I guess it's more than several thousand, but even, 20,000 books at $5 a pop, in the traditional publishing world, you're probably considered a failure, because, the traditional publishers have to take their cut, and then your agent takes their cut, and taxes and everything. You're left with not a whole lot of money in your pocket, and neither is anyone else. But if you're, pocketing the vast majority of those, $10,000, 10,000 book sales per year, you can see how, you've made, $50,000 in revenue anyway. Obviously taxes and Amazon takes their cut, but you can see how you can sell at a volume that would be considered a failure in the traditional publishing world, and you would certainly not be a bestseller selling 10,000 books a year. But if you're a self-publisher where, other than paying Amazon their share of the royalties, you're pocketing the rest of that money, you can see how you can still have a nice, successful career there. So all of that, those three things are really what motivated me to go the independent publishing route. So Jan, thanks for that question. I will say it's a very, very personal decision for folks. Obviously I decided traditional publishing is not for me, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the wrong avenue for you. I encourage you to research the issue extensively before you make a decision one way or the other. And some of it might be genre specific as well, so keep that in mind. And if you have any more questions about it, feel free to shoot me an email, dtkane@dtkane.com, especially if you're someone earlier on in your writing career and maybe you're facing this decision. I'd be happy to, at least give you a little more detail on how I arrived at my decision. Okay, so that's our listener question this week, and we'll just wrap up with our quote of the week, which you can have emailed to you each and every week if you sign up for DT Kane's weekly newsletter. Just head on over to dtkane.com/email-sign-up. There's also links to that in the backs of my books, so you can find the link there as well. So this week's quote comes from Mark Lawrence in his novel Red Sister. "A book is as dangerous as any journey you might take. The person who closes the back cover may not be the same one that opened the front one. Treat them with respect." Again, that's Mark Lawrence from his novel Red Sister. And my little essay this week is as follows. "Can knowledge ever be a bad thing? I'd argue no. Knowledge is neither inherently good nor evil. It is the use to which it is put that determines its morality. What is unquestionably wrong, however, is restricting one's ability to obtain knowledge. Therein lies a path to evil, for once acquisition of knowledge is restricted, inequity is sure to follow. It is a lack of knowledge, be it through laws, willful blindness, or simple ignorance, that is to blame for much of the world's problems. If we each could just ask a few more questions and read a few more books, how much better off would we all be? And kind of like I referenced earlier when we were talking about the Haitian slave revolution, this idea of knowledge acquisition or restriction of knowledge acquisition is certainly a theme that's touched on again and again in the spoken books Uprising. So I liked this quote as gave me an opportunity to expound on that idea just a little bit more. All right, and that's it for one of the more stressful episodes of the podcast thus far, largely because of this power outage and me scrambling to recover my files. Frankly, with the amount of time I spent doing that, I should have just re-recorded the episode. But if you've ever recorded something and then written something too, and then faced the prospect of having to do it all again from scratch, it just feels terrible. So I'm glad I fixed it mostly. Sorry about the video for those of you watching on YouTube. But we'll be back with regular video next week. So until next time, this has been D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Thanks for listening to D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. If you liked today's episode, please consider rating and reviewing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and hit that subscribe button and the bell so you get notified whenever new episodes become available. If you'd like to listen to back episodes or review the show notes, visit dtkane.com/podcast. D.T. Kane's novels are available for purchase at most major online retailers, or you can purchase directly from his website at www.dtkane.com/books. You can receive a free short story and sign up for D.T. Kane's mailing list at dtkane.com/email-signup. If you'd like to connect, you can find D.T. Kane on Facebook at D.T. Kane Author or Twitter at D.T. Kane Author, or send D.T. Kane an email at dtkane@dtkane.com. See you next week.